Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Bill Newmann. And for those of you who don't know Bill, he's a professor of political science here at VCU, where he has been since 1992. He teaches courses in the US presidency, a very important topic. Probably this year more, although Bill will say that it's relevant every year. We just feel the urgency of this topic now more than in previous years. U.S. foreign policy, U.S. national security, terrorism and counterterrorism, Asian politics, international political economy, comparative national security policy, and international relations. Professor Newmann's research interests include the U.S. presidency, U.S. national security policy and policymaking, and East Asian security. His publications are many, but I will just dwell on two books: Managing National Security Policy, The President and the Process, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2003, and his most recent book, he will talk to us about today, Isolation and Engagement, Presidential Decision-Making on China from Kennedy to Nixon, published by University of Michigan Press in 2022. Professor Newmann has promised that if time allows, he will give us a little glimpse into his most recent research project. So stay tuned. Professor Newmann, welcome to Meet VCU Authors, and congratulations on the publication of your book, Isolation and Engagement, Presidential Decision-Making on China from Kennedy to Nixon.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to share the screen. We'll see if this works out. And in theory?
Perfect.
Good. All right. Outstanding. Okay, so what I would like to do is talk about the work that I do, sort of broadly, and also talk about the book specifically. And as you can see by the title of this, Presidential Decision-Making in Foreign Policy, How Presidents Manage the Advisory Process, that's what I do. That's it. That's my main focus of research. That's what I've been doing for more than 30 years, really, because I kind of started this as an undergraduate, which I'll talk about a little bit. So let's see. First of all, what do I do? How do I do this? And what I do is I go to archives. That's it. And I go to archives and try to find out exactly what presidents and their advisors were doing, really kind of on a day-to-day basis. And I've been to 9 presidential libraries, and they've got pictures of all the libraries there. They're all kind of fascinating, and they also kind of reflect the presidents themselves. They've got sort of a character that's put there by some of the foundations. So, for instance, Eisenhower's library, it's kind of like it's 1956 in Eisenhower's library. So when you're working there, you're doing some interesting things. And at lunchtime, a security guard comes in and says, "It's lunchtime, everybody out." Throws everybody out and says, "Time for lunch. You know, your mom and dad want you to have a good balanced meal. So out of the library, that's it, and go get lunch." The Johnson Library, it's like 1966 inside that library. The Reagan Library, on the other hand, is very, very expensive, and it's the only place I couldn't afford to buy any toys and gifts and things for people. And the Nixon Library actually was interesting because Watergate didn't exist until a couple of years ago in that library, and they actually revamped it to say, oh, and by the way, there was some controversy during the Nixon administration. But this is what I do when I go through the libraries. And just to give you an idea of kind of what that might look like is in the libraries, well, you get carts filled with documents and boxes that will tell you exactly who the person produced these documents. And by law, any piece of paper produced by people who work for the president, well, that's going to go in a box. In fact, when you look through some of the folders inside the boxes, what you find is that the papers there are actually in reverse chronological order, because the person who's taking care of this stuff finishes with a piece of paper, puts it in a folder, and then tomorrow puts the next piece of paper on top of that. And so that's the pile that you get. So it's pretty cool. You can look through it and find out what's going on day by day. So there's a cart. You get 18 boxes on a cart, and that's all you can take out at any one time. And then you can only have one box on your desk at a time. When you open that box, one folder from a box on your desk, and that's it. Now, let's see. Here's two of my favorite folders. It's one from the Eisenhower Library, which just says banana on it. Completely empty. Have no idea what was in it. It might have to do with the United States involvement in a coup in Guatemala, but that's my guess on that. And from the Carter administration, my favorite one is the Paperwork Reduction Act folder, which is very, very thick. And you can see that this is the third folder of many. So they weren't really doing a good job there, reducing the paperwork. But this is the kind of stuff I do, looking through all this to try to see if there are patterns in how presidents make decisions. Oh yeah, and one more fun thing. Documents are great because you're looking at documents, and often original documents. And so you can see handwritten notes for an NSC meeting in 1971 during the Nixon administration. So that's pretty great. And on the other side, you've got a national security decision memorandum from the Nixon administration. And that's Henry Kissinger's writing all over it. And he revised this, and don't have time to go through it, but I could talk about this memo for about a half an hour because this told me so much about how things operate within the Nixon administration. I think in the book there are 3 pages on just this memo because it was just so fascinating. But this is the kind of stuff that you learn, in which someone produces a memo and then someone else writes all over it and says, here's how I want to change it. And this is a memo that specifically talks about how a president is going to manage some decision-making on China. And the original idea was to do it a certain way, and Kissinger said, no, let's do it a different way. And that's kind of neat because it told you so much about what they were doing. Other documents aren't so helpful. So you get a lot of these because I'm doing foreign policy. So a lot of stuff is classified. So this is also the kind of stuff that you get when you go through it, and you spend a long time trying to get something declassified, years maybe trying to get something declassified. And when they declassify it, this is what it looks like. All right, so let's talk about the actual research itself and what it was about. So actually goes back to an undergraduate assignment back from 1981, I guess, when I was in a course on U.S. foreign policy, and we were given Graham Allison's book, which is one of the classics of foreign policy decision-making. Said, read this and do an assessment of it. And the short version of it is, Allison said, all right, there are 3 different ways of looking at the way the United States government makes foreign policy decisions. One is a rational actor model in which the government actually behaves almost as if it's one analytical brain and does a cost-benefit analysis of everything and says, okay, here's the option of, we'll come up with 7 options, and here are the options assessed versus the highest cost versus the lowest cost versus the highest benefits versus the lowest benefits, and you try to pick the option that has the lowest costs and the most benefits, and it's very rational. Right. So Allison looked at that and said, well, that would be great, but that never happens because that's just not the way government works. It's usually that government does things different ways. And there are 2 other models. One is the organizational process model that says, actually, the government is made up of organizations, and the organizations are doing battle every time there's a decision and fighting it out to see which organization is going to be able to implement its standard operating procedures. And that can be really, really ugly and knock down, drag out fights. And eventually they compromise. And there's a third model that's a bureaucratic politics model that says it's not organizations that are battling, it's individuals. Powerful individuals, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, and they go to war with each other. And the outcome of that battle and coalitions that are formed and people who win and people who lose is a decision. So you go from this rational actor model, which says everything is very, very much a calculation of national interest to these two other models that say, well, it's more like all hell breaks loose every time there's a decision that needs to be made. And what you get is a compromise that may be nobody's first choice, that may not solve the problem, that may have more to do with the relationships among decision makers and organizations than to any conception of the national interest. So it's sort of an ugly version of it. Well, I read this book and I said, well, this is really fascinating, but the case study is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the United States and the Soviet Union were, some people said, it was a 50-50 chance that there was going to be World War III and a nuclear war. So how do you take a crisis decision like this, which took place over 13 days and involved nuclear weapons and maybe World War III, and use that as an example of the way the United States government normally makes decisions during routine periods? Right? This is the most unusual case study that you can find. So it's a bad choice of case study. And I thought to myself, okay, this is really interesting. I've come up with something that's pretty useful. And I love writing the paper. And I said, okay, maybe this stuff is for me because I'm writing a paper about the methodology of the study. And that's not something that undergraduates usually focus on. So I said, all right, this is really cool. I've discovered something. This is useful theory, but the case study is the wrong case study. And I wrote this paper and I loved it. And I said, wow, this is probably the best thing I've ever done in my life. And I turned it in and bam, D-. I said, okay, hooray for me. Maybe I have a different major in mind. Maybe I should do something else with my life. But I said, no. I said, I think I'm right. And I said, I'm going to keep pushing this stuff. And that's what my dissertation was about. So I kept at it. And my dissertation said, all right, there's something else going on here and we're missing it. Especially if we use a crisis as our example of routine decision-making. So I recovered from the D- and was able to go to graduate school. And what I came up with is the premises of really everything that I do is to focus on normal decision-making. So crisis decision-making is unusual. It may have a long-term effect on some normal decision-making in that you do something during a crisis that you go, oh, this is useful. Let's standardize it a little bit later on. But most of the time, routine decision-making is very different from a crisis decision. So here are the premises of the work that I do in most of the articles that I've published and the book that I've written and the book that I'm working on now. Every president's decision-making system changes over time. So what a president is doing the first month in office and the way that he or she makes decisions is different from the way they'll make decisions 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and certainly in their last year. Right? So in order to understand how decision-making works, you need to think of it as a decision-making process that evolves. And so the first model was the evolution model, right? And you find that when you start to study the way decision-making evolves in different presidential administrations, you find that there's a pattern of how presidents' decision-making evolves that's identifiable across administrations. So one administration seems to evolve the same way as another administration and another administration. So they all seem to be learning the same thing over time. They come in and say, this is how I'm going to do it. And over time, they say, you know what, I kind of need to do it a different way. So time matters. So looking at, for instance, the Cuban Missile Crisis and saying, this is how the Kennedy administration makes decisions. Well, that's how they made decisions in October of 1962. That's not how they made decisions in January of 1961. It's not how they made decisions in August of 1963. Things change and things are different. So we need to look at those patterns and say, okay, what can we learn from looking at those patterns? That's why the archival research really starts to matter, because you've got to really dig into this stuff and sort of do some research that says, all right, let's look at the way we were doing things in this administration in Johnson, for instance, in 1964, and then look at it again in 1965, and again in 66, and again in 67 to see how things change over time. So the first project I did, the first book was on nuclear strategy and arms control, and I looked at Carter, Reagan, and Bush and considered how their decision-making processes evolved over time. And this one was not really archive research because the declassified information wasn't there. So this was all publicly available stuff, which meant less detailed than the kind of stuff that I can do for administrations that are a little bit farther in the past. Second project looked at the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administration policy on China and Taiwan. And this is a really cool picture because this is Kennedy's inauguration, and this is the only picture I could find that had Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon just sort of in the same shot. Also, Eisenhower, of course, is there. And the product of this, two books, first Managing National Security Policy, and then Isolation and Engagement over on the right, and then the translation of Managing National Security Policy into Chinese, which is really cool. That's the coolest thing that I've ever done, is that somebody said, we want to translate this into a foreign language. And that was great. And it was published by the Taiwan Ministry of Defense, which is probably why I'll never get a visa to go to China. But that's really cool. And I actually know someone who spoke Chinese, and I asked them, I said, okay, is this actually my book, or is this like a cookbook or a travelogue or something that has my name on it? And they looked at it and they said, no, this is actually your book. So I was very excited about that. All right. So what I did is I took that first evolution balance model and I evolved that model. I added to it. And the second book comes up with an evolution balance model because it did something kind of unusual. As I looked back at the first book and I said, you know, this doesn't quite get it. There's things that are missing there, and I'll learn more if I do more administrations and if I get deeper into the archival material. So I did the next book, which was actually on Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and I've got Eisenhower up here for an example. But here's the next version of this theory, and it starts with a basic premise that presidential style doesn't change. Presidents come into office and they say, all right, this is how I like to do things. And you're not going to change me. You're not going to convince me that I need to do things differently. I'm the president of the United States. I got here doing things my way. And so I'm really skeptical that anybody's going to tell me that if I only did it this way, I will have a better career. I will, achieve something greater than this. I mean, don't tell me I'm doing it wrong. However, as we'll see, that's what happens. So hold on for just a second. But the first premise is presidential style doesn't really change. Presidents like to do things their way. Eisenhower liked to do things in a very formal way, very systematic. Kennedy liked to do things very informally. That's just the way he liked. Get a group of people in the room and sit down and smack brains together, and we'll come up with something. And Nixon was really interesting because the most vicious politician of our time, you can argue, could not handle interpersonal conflict face to face at all, and liked to do things by himself, literally on a legal pad through cost-benefit analysis, and then sort of hand out decisions down the line. And as I found out, it was Henry Kissinger who kept trying to get the bureaucracy involved in it, and Nixon kept trying to push all his advisors out of the administration decision-making process because he couldn't handle disagreement. Fascinating stuff when I started finding all these great memos about all that stuff. Well, so presidential style is almost like a constant. Presidents say, this is the way I want to do it, and it's going to be almost impossible for me to change. Now, having said all that, what I found, and this goes back to the first model in the first book and back to my dissertation, is that presidents, after about 6 months, really are making decisions in three different ways, through three different structures. That's just the nomenclature I'd use. They have a formal structure, which is generally the National Security Council, where National Security Council membership is designed by law, actually, the National Security Act of 1947. It's a formal structure with a committee and then series of subordinate committees. And presidents use that and often come into office saying, this is how I'm going to do things. And they write up this long memo on organizing the National Security Council with very specific who's in meetings, how we do all these things. Very, very formal. So presidents will usually create that. Then after a few months, they'll realize this is big and unwieldy and it takes forever to make decisions. And they come up with a kind of an informal structure, which is kind of a shorthand in which the president and some of the key advisors will meet on a regular basis. The advisors will actually meet without the president on a Thursday, and then they'll meet with the president on a Friday, and it's maybe of a committee of 4 to 6 people who are the key decision makers for the president. And it's sort of a national security structure with just the top present. You get rid of all the staffers, you get rid of all the paperwork in a lot of cases, and the president can sit there and say, okay, now we're going to get into things, we're going to talk about things that we don't want leaking to the New York Times and the Washington Post. And when the president's not in the room, the top level advisors, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, can get into arguments that they don't want the president to hear, and they don't want the president to see them arguing. But they also have the ability to form a consensus that they can bring to the National Security Council and saying, here's what the top level people have decided. And then a National Security Council meeting might have 30 people in it. And so that gets unwieldy and difficult to come up with a consensus. So you get that shorthand informal structure. Then also there's a confidence structure. And that's the president and maybe 1 or 2 advisors that the president says, these are the people I trust the most. Before I make a decision, I want to turn to one person who I think I have more confidence in than anybody else and saying, am I doing the right thing? What about my legacy? Is this going to go down as my Bay of Pigs, the name basically given to every foreign policy disaster? Or is this going to go down as my Cuban Missile Crisis, basically my greatest foreign policy success? And I need you to let me know, because I only trust you, because you're going to tell me the straight scoop. You'll tell me no, when other people won't. And often the president doesn't know doesn't know who the person will be that they can trust the most until they've actually made a bunch of decisions. So you come up with an administration and you pick this person who you have confidence in and you put them at Secretary of State, and this person you have confidence in and put them at National Security Advisor. And it isn't after a few months that you go, boy, I made a really bad decision on that Secretary of State. And here's the person I really want. And that's the person I'm going to use as my sounding board when I need it. So a president will use all 3 of these to make decisions. And they don't necessarily call them these things. And this is the analysis that I use to call them these things. But the first research I did said, yeah, they're all there. You can identify them. And when I did some interviews, people said, hey, yeah, that's kind of what was going on. Not necessarily explicitly, but that's what was going on. So once you start from that, then the evolution balance model says, all right, what's going on is that there's a continuous assessment of the system. All right, presidents say, all right, I'm in office, here's my system. And then they explicitly say, usually to their national security advisor, who's the person that manages the National Security Council itself. That's a position that is not approved by the Senate. So it's a staffer, and the president says, this is the person I want to manage all of this stuff. And you don't have to appear before Congress. Your office is down the hall. You're in the West Wing of the White House. So this is a person who the president can stick his head out of the Oval Office and shout down the hall and say, come here, as opposed to the Secretary of State. And this person does not have to speak to the press if they don't want to. So they're really an internal decision maker, and the president can really trust them in a lot of ways that they don't necessarily trust a cabinet officer who's got an entire bureaucracy, an entire executive department that they're responsible for. This person is only responsible to the president. And so presidents say, your job, look at this decision-making system and monitor it. Tell me, is this working for me? What are the bottlenecks? What are the pitfalls here? I just made a decision. How did that work? So there's actually a continuous assessment. And when you go into these archives, you find all these memos in which people are saying, this is what worked. This is what didn't work. Maybe we should try this. Maybe we should create this committee. Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should do that. And in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations, Kennedy and Johnson's first guy for taking care of this was McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor. And then Bundy was replaced by Walt Rostow, who also did an assessment of the system. As soon as he became National Security Advisor, he said, okay, I'm going to assess the system. And his decision on that was to say, our decision-making system doesn't work. We need to completely restructure it. And they restructured the system. And the punchline on this is he said, our system is informal. There is no formal system here. And because of that, things are dropping out of the system. Decisions aren't being made. Too much is being handed to the President of the United States. He's overworked. And we need to create a formal system which will take some decisions and manage them for the president, so it's not Lyndon Johnson sitting in his bedroom until 2 o'clock in the morning doing all the staff work. He needs more help. And Henry Kissinger was the guy who did it for Richard Nixon. And he also said, we need to change the system. And actually, within 6 to 7 months of the system, Kissinger created 6 different committees that were subcommittees of the National Security Council, and they did most of the work rather than the full National Security Council. And none of those committees had Richard Nixon on them. And Kissinger was chair of almost all of them. So National Security Advisor's job is to go ahead and assess this system. Now, here's the thing that I think is really fascinating. Is what will happen is they'll assess the system and then they'll come up with proposals for change. And 2 things about the proposals for change that are interesting is that the purpose of this change in all the administrations I looked at is to find a better balance between the informal and formal systems and what I've called the confidence system, is to get a better balance. If the decision-making process is too formal, you add informality to it. If it's too informal, you add formality to it. If it leans too much to the confidence structure, which the president isn't hearing from a lot of people, well, you build some committees that will hear from a lot of people. If the president is hearing from everybody and has no way of differentiating between the good advice and bad advice, the National Security Advisor says, you need to rely on some single person a little bit more. So it's always about balance between the 3 structures, which I thought was really fascinating. But most of the time, it's to compensate for weaknesses, and those weaknesses come from a bad balance. But most of the time, it seems that the National Security Advisor came up with an answer that said, Mr. President, right, and imagine this, right? The president says, this isn't working. What I'm doing isn't working. What's the problem with our decision-making system? And the advisors say, you are. And that's what usually happens. The way you like to do things doesn't work. And that takes a lot of guts for someone to say, Mr. President, you're the problem. But in all the administrations I've looked at, that's happened. The National Security Advisor or the Secretary of State has said, Mr. President, you're the problem. The way you do things doesn't work. And that's a fascinating thing because you would expect, well, the president says, no, this is the way I do things, and I'm not going to change, and you're fired. Right? That's it. And that didn't happen for anybody in any case until Donald Trump, in which the National Security Advisor had said, you don't have a system here. It's completely informal. No one knows what's going on. No one knows what the policies are. You make decisions by tweet, and we find out what U.S. foreign policy is by looking on Twitter. Right? We need to create a system. Right? And actually, we have a system that's written down about how we're supposed to make decisions, and we don't use it. And I'm your new National Security Advisor, and I say we need to use it. And Trump's response in several cases was, you know what? You're not my new National Security Advisor. You're fired. That's it. But in most cases, presidents say, okay, I'm going to try to fix this. I will do what you want me to do, or I'll try to do what you want me to do. And often they give it a try, and then they don't like it. So they sometimes reject the advice, or they implement the advice sort of in a half-assed manner. They say, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to create this new committee, and this new committee will solve all our problems, and then they ignore the new committee. Or they use it for 6 months and then get bored with it and don't use it. But it's fascinating because that dynamic is sort of not a battle, but an attempt by the president, right, to make a choice about how to do things, to accept or reject the changes for overall decision-making process, or sometimes for decisions on specific issues. Like someone will say, our policy on China, in the case of my case studies, we need to do it a little bit of a different way. And I looked at Kennedy, and there he's meeting with some leaders from Taiwan, and that's Lyndon Johnson in Taiwan. And there's Nixon meeting with Mao. So you saw this change in a lot of the process where presidents say, I'm going to try to do this differently. And in the case of Kennedy, they actually tried to do things differently. And then Kennedy got kind of bored with the new processes and said, I like doing things informally. I'm just going to wing it. That's it. Johnson actually restructured the entire decision-making process for national security. He created a whole new process, which to a certain extent replicated the old formal process that Eisenhower had created, but they just called it different things. It's just different names for different committees. And Nixon came into office and to a certain extent replicated what Eisenhower had done, a very formal system, and then spent time just sort of ignoring it whenever it seemed like it was too cumbersome, and relied mostly on Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor. And Kissinger actually ran a more formal system that Nixon was not included in, because Nixon said, I do not want to be part of this. No, you just do those things. You can talk to assistant secretaries of state all you want. I don't want to be anywhere near them at all. So it's kind of fascinating the way this all worked, and there's this big tug of war on things. And generally what happened is the goal of it, as I said before, is to come up with a balance between formal, informal, and confidence structures, one that works for the president, and that may take years to do, and it may never be achieved. And in all my case studies, I found Reagan was too reliant on the formal system, and that's one of the reasons things collapsed in his administration. His first term, things were doing pretty well, but if you can look at his administration, and he had a very formal system, and because that formal system seemed to be so slow, Reagan actually bypassed that formal system, and people started winging it, and people started being entrepreneurial, and that led to Iran-Contra, because they tried to avoid that formal system, because the formal system would have stopped that and caught it, but there was no informal system or confidence system that could back it up and say, whoa, whoa, Mr. President, you need to see this. And so Iran-Contra happened. Carter started out with a kind of a formal system and eventually moved to a more confidence structure-based system, leaning on Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. That's in the picture on the upper right. And Johnson leaned on Dean Rusk, his Secretary of State, because they were the only Southerners in the advisory group. And so he thought, Rusk is my guy. He's from Georgia, I'm from Texas. Everybody else seems to be from Harvard. So we're kind of ignore those guys because they don't understand how things actually work. And George Herbert Walker Bush was the administration that focused on an informal structure. And you can see Bush and his key advisors, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that system worked the best because he had a confidence structure and he had a formal structure, but he had an informal structure which sort of tied it all together and worked very, very well. But that was an administration that was unusual because all of those guys also were in the Ford administration and all worked together. So they had worked in national security processes before, and they had actually become really, really good friends. They used to go on camping trips together before they wound up running U.S. foreign policy. So that's unusual that you had that case, but it worked really well. You had the fewest amount of feuds that you usually get in some administration. So the lessons, and this is just something I'll make sure everybody has the slides, but if it's too formal, you get gridlock and conflict. If it's too reliant on the confidence structure, people feel like they're ignored. You get resignations. You get poorly staffed decisions because everybody kind of wings it. You get isolation of the president because he's only got one voice talking in his ear. And that the best thing to do is have a strong informal structure that balances out between that formal structure and the confidence structure. And the Bush administration did that. The George Herbert Walker Bush administration did that the best of all the administrations that I've studied so far. And I'm continuing on with all this kind of stuff. And I think we're at, we're at 12:40. So let me stop there. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. And the next thing was to talk about the other book, but I can do that if people have questions about that or however we're going to work it.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Bill. This is fascinating. And I loved seeing all pictures of all your archival documents and, the the Kissinger memo, highly annotated, I guess, and the banana folder. And very, very interesting. I see that there is a question already in the chat from Aryan Patel. So I'm going to go to that question first, and then just a reminder to the audience members to please post your question either here or in the Q&A. I think Ariane's question came during your discussion of the three types of presidential decisions, right? The formal, informal, and confidence structure. And he asks, can the council or panel of officials overturn the president's decision if there's a majority on one side? Thank you for this question.
Okay, cool question. So no. So everybody can say, Mr. President, we think you should do this, you should do that. What you're trying to do is a bad idea, and the president can say, this is what we're doing. That's it. He has the final say. So it's not like more of a cabinet decision making that you would have in a parliamentary system, where a prime minister, in some cases, might actually take a vote. In this case, the president will make decisions. And there's a famous quote, and I have no idea if it's actually real or not, where people said Lincoln actually surveyed his cabinet and said, okay, how many people are for this proposal? If you're for it, say aye. If you're against it, say nay. And he said, what do you think? And his entire cabinet said nay. And Lincoln said, okay, the ayes. And he raised his hand and said aye. And then he said, the ayes have it. So that's the way it would work in reality. And of course, the president can turn around and say, you all disagree with me, you're all fired. So
that's risk.
They've got to think about that too.
Thank you so much. We have another question from one of our guests, Cartwright Foreman. And the question is whether you might say something about the underlying principles that would drive making a process formal, informal, or otherwise? Thank you so much for this question.
Uh, so well, the backdrop of this is to look at some decision-making theory, which actually comes from business schools and organization theory and public administration. So my degree is in public policy. So it's looking at, okay, what causes that? Why would you actually go from formal to informal to confidence, or the other way around? And the answer seemed to be part of it is that the president's time is the most precious resource in government. The president has so many things to do, and the American president basically is responsible for everything in the world. And that's just the foreign policy side of it. And then there's also the domestic politics side of it. So the idea is that the president of the United States, everybody wants him or her to take care of everything that you can imagine, and he's got to solve every single problem in the world, right? You've got the war in Gaza, you've got the war in Ukraine, you've got the war in Yemen, you've got China threatening Taiwan, all of these things. And the American president is supposed to solve all these problems, and he's supposed to solve all these problems the first year he's in office, or else the press starts saying, well, what's going on? The president hasn't solved all the problems. So there's all that pressure. So the president needs basically safety valves to where things are going to get done, analysis is going to get done, papers are going to be prepared, so that the president doesn't have to read everything and know everything. Other people need to do that. So there's got to be some delegation there. There's also just learning, right? You get into office and you, in most cases, have not been president before. And the only cases of that, Calvin Coolidge was president before, the second time he became president. And if Donald Trump wins, then he's got a second chance to be president. Other than that, you're a novice and you're walking in and everything is about learning. And in a lot of cases, your advisors know more than you do because they may have been closer to the presidency than you've ever been. So you learn over time, and you learn, okay, here are things that don't work, here are things that do work. I can't be my own chief of staff, and presidents learn that. I can't manage all of this, and presidents learn that. The last president who managed all of this, Lyndon Johnson, did it for about 1.5 years. And that was it. It's just too hard to do. So you learn what works. You also learn about people. You learn, again, which choices of advisors were good choices and which choices were bad choices. So you learn that. And the third thing was, which we called, people I work with, actually my dissertation advisor, we were trying to bang our heads about a name, but we called it a principle of political time. You learn sort of the political timing of when decisions have to be made and when decisions can be deferred, and how you can manipulate the timing of decisions. So you've got sort of a time structure in which you're elected, and then there are midterm elections, and then there's re-election, and you've got to make decisions sort of around those key events, because you don't want certain decisions hanging during an election year, and some decisions you want to hide during an election year. And then there's also ways to manipulate that. You can set deadlines, you can schedule summits and things like that to make the bureaucracy move a little faster. But when you put all that stuff together, it winds up meaning, all right, the president says, I need all of this. I need a formal structure, I need an informal structure, I need a confidence structure. And those are sort of the underlying reasons for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this generous answer. We'll take a couple more questions, and then I think we'll switch back to learn more about Bill's current project. In a previous slide, I really loved how you included the cover of your first book's translation into Chinese. There we go. And our next question here from an anonymous attendee is about this translation. Can you please explain a little bit more about why you think your translated book might have appealed to the Taiwanese Ministry of National Defense?
Oh, I have no idea, because it didn't have anything to do with China at all. I mean, the current book does, but
But it was published in Taiwan, right?
Right. And so this
Yeah.
book was published in Taiwan. Yeah. And so uh, I'm not sure. But the University of Pittsburgh was the publisher, and they got a call from the Taiwan Ministry of Defense and said, we'd like to translate this into Chinese and give it out to our officer corps.
Oh, interesting.
So the only thing I can think is that a lot of the things in there and a lot of the lessons about it are not just about the presidency, but I think any executive decision maker
Uh-huh.
could learn things, because a lot of the ideas are derived not just from political science, but from management and from public administration.
And policy.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, great. Thank you. Our colleague Purojena asked or mentions first that a good decision depends on sound and reliable data. And very nicely put as a scientist. And thank you so much for being here. Now, he also says that sometimes the data may not be available, and the database decisions may differ from intuition. How do various presidents deal with this? That's an excellent question about the data question in this decision-making process. Thank you very much, Puru.
Yeah. What I found as I looked through this, and let's see, let me go back to yeah. So Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, the one thing that the three of them had in common is that these guys were voracious readers, and they wanted every single bit of information they could possibly find. Other presidents, not necessarily. Ronald Reagan kind of wasn't that interested in eating a lot of information and getting a lot of details on things. And George Herbert Walker Bush actually walked into the presidency knowing as much about foreign policy as, well, maybe more than most of his advisors. He'd been director of CIA. So he had a lot of information and could actually call up people in CIA and say, tell me what's going on, things like that. But Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, they read everything. So they wanted as much information as possible. I mentioned Johnson reading until 2 o'clock in the morning. Literally, the guy never slept. And he seemed to know more about things. And one of the cool things about the archives is you see all the memos written by people in the National Security Council staff or in State Department or Defense Department that are going to the National Security Advisor. And then the president is getting, here's a 20-page memo. Here, and it's just, read this, you'll be interested in it. And they were eating up all this stuff. So when they weren't sure, you saw all three of them would pepper their staff with questions because they wanted to know, all right, what do we know? And what things do we not know, right? There's that famous Donald Rumsfeld quotes when he was Secretary of Defense. People actually turned a few speeches of his into poems. And one of the poems was To Know. And it was, there are things we know and things we know we don't know and things we don't know, right? There was this true and also funny at the same time. But that's the stuff that presidents were always saying is, I want to know what we don't know. You tell me when there's a big hole. Do not tell me you know things that you're not sure about. I want to know you have confidence in this information or you don't. And all of that is in the memo traffic, which is great. And they'll actually say, and there's a big hole about this stuff here.
Interesting.
And that's what I thought was fascinating. And I went through it and I said, wow, Kennedy's brilliant, Johnson is brilliant, and Nixon is brilliant. I felt really bad about thinking that, but Nixon was brilliant and knew his foreign policy as well as all of his advisors.
Excellent. Just in the interest of time, I'm very sorry to interrupt this this answer to get to our last question asked by our colleague In Chao Kao, and the question also it relates to your I think, translation of of your first book into Chinese, but and you know, Taiwan being part of the conversation, but also the question seems to be about how the structure styles of the policy making process may or may not vary by party affiliation. So when Nixon and Carter, for instance, took steps to unfriend Taiwan and friend China,
Mhm.
he asks, did their policy-making process styles influence their final decisions,
Mhm.
or did they not? Thank you.
It didn't seem that they influenced the final decisions. So both of them came into office saying, we need to recognize China. And the key factor there was the balance of power in the world and the possibility of the Soviet threat. Uh, for well, that was the primary motivation for Nixon. When Carter came in, Carter essentially was saying détente requires us to have a good relationship with both the Soviet Union and China. And it isn't until later in his administration, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, when he starts thinking a little bit more along the lines of Nixon and saying, okay, you know, China is a balancer to the Soviet Union, but that's always the way his national security advisor thought of China, as balancing out the Soviet Union. And that was the key voice whispering in his ear. But the process didn't seem to affect the outcome uh, that much. It affected the motivations of the outcome, as Carter leaned more heavily on his national security advisor, who thought of things in the context of balance of power politics. That's where Carter's head also went. Carter, some people say, started out in the presidency as an idealist, saying we want a world of peace and human rights, and everything's going to be wonderful, and we're going to move off into a more multilateral world. And left office more as the Soviets are bad and we've got to balance out their power because the Cold War is heating up again.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. One thing that I'd like to look at is the relationship between the decision-making style and the policy outcome.
Mhm.
Partly that's the second book is going to tackle a little bit of it.
Wonderful. And so I think this is a nice segue into your final segment, which is a brief introduction to what are you working on right now, Bill Newman?
Oh, okay. I've got slides on that. Next project is this, right? Carter and Reagan. When you study foreign policy, you say, all right, these two guys couldn't be any different in terms of their foreign policy, what they wanted to accomplish in the world. And yet their policies toward China and Taiwan are nearly identical. Right? So what explains that? And I'm going to look at the joint communiques of 1979 under Carter and the joint communique of 1982 under Reagan. And those are joint U.S.-Chinese communiques that sort of established the relationship between the United States and China. The United States did not formally recognize China until January 1st, 1979. And that communique was the product of a series of negotiations that went on from the moment Carter got into office all the way through. And to a certain extent, you can say that that joint communique is a product of Nixon negotiations, Ford negotiations, and Carter negotiations with China. And that established the relationship. And the 1980 communique also sort of set some ground rules for some of the stuff left over. And the map, you'll see China and Taiwan, and those leftover things were related to Taiwan. And the United States had recognized Taiwan as China until 1979. So we recognize that tiny island there of Taiwan as being the legitimate government of all of what you see on this map until 1979. Right? And the short version is that government on Taiwan is the government that lost the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and fled to Taiwan and set up shop there and said, someday we'll return and take all of that over. And China, of course, said, no, this is ours. And by the way, Taiwan will someday be ours as well. So Reagan and And Carter had the same policy, which was, all of this. And I know we don't have time to go through all of it, but the key aspect of it is establishing normal relations with China. The United States would de-recognize Taiwan, say it's not the government of China, but the United States was going to maintain unofficial economic, political, and security relations with Taiwan. And the big controversial thing is that the United States is saying to China, to the Beijing communist government there, we recognize you, you're the legitimate government, and we understand that you want someday to reincorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China, even though it has an independent government and it functions like it's an independent country. But we're going to continue to sell weapons to Taiwan. And if you don't like that, then you can sever your relationship with us, because we're going to sell weapons to Taiwan, and we will not stop. And both Carter and Reagan were willing to jeopardize the entire relationship with China over selling weapons. Reagan actually kind of fudged it in the 1982 communique, said, we won't sell weapons to Taiwan in greater numbers than we do now, and we'll eventually stop selling weapons to Taiwan, but we won't set a date. All right, and as I've often explained in my class, what that means, in diplomatic language, it means that eventually the sun will actually expand and will engulf the earth, and that's kind of when we'll stop selling weapons to Taiwan. But it is a date, right? Estimated date, so there is an end date on this.
Interesting.
That's the kind of, it's like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the United States says we'll eventually get rid of our nuclear weapons.
Keyword being eventually.
Right. And these were the same policy for Carter and Reagan. So the why. And then I do some political science theory to try to explain.
Wonderful. And so, Bill, we look forward to welcoming you back soon-ish, to talk to us more about this new book on Carter, Reagan, China, and Taiwan, titled To Be Determined at some point. And fascinating materials. I took a lot of notes. I did not know about Nixon and how he couldn't handle interpersonal conflict. I think that's and I still do have a question for you I want to end with before we wrap it up for today, just to bring it back to the present, and to put things into contemporary context. How do you see the presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, for instance, fit into your evolution balance model?
So don't know yet all the details of all this, because as I've said, I like to go into the archives to sort of make a decision. But there was a really interesting article, and I can't remember if it was the Washington Post or New York Times, and there have been some other articles on Harris's decision making, and the articles were interesting because the articles seemed to try to put a really negative spin on things and says, well, Kamala Harris is a tough boss, and she asks people questions, and she asks people questions about their footnotes, and you've got to be prepared when you walk into the office. And if you can't tell her why she needs to know this, she gets ticked off at you. And this was supposed to be a negative thing. And I looked at it and I said, oh, that's what a good executive does. I mean, a good executive says, anybody who wastes my time doesn't get my time anymore. And the higher up you are in government, the more important that is. All right. So these were negative things that I read as, this is all good. I mean, an executive asked questions about this footnote, and I thought, wow, that's fantastic. That's great. That's just like other presidents who were on the ball and everything and said, I need to be the most informed person here, but I also have to really economize on my time. So these are all good things. And we don't know enough about Harris's decision-making style, but we do know that she got a campaign up and running in a month. And a campaign that seems to be doing all the things that you need to do. And if you can do that in a month, either Harris or the people she's hired to manage things, they're doing a phenomenal job on things because that's so difficult. And I can just tell you right now, the difference in the kind of text traffic I get asking me for money compared to Biden, compared to Harris. Wow, the Harris people are like floating outside my window every night, knocking on it and saying, "Please, more money, just $10." But that's a management style that says, all right, they seem to be 21st century management, and handling things better than you would expect, given that they've had what, a couple weeks of notice that they were going to be running a presidential campaign.
Yeah, absolutely.